Welcome back to WetWired, everyone. I'm Sean Ondas.
And I'm Julian Paul Butt.
Today we're joined by Casey, the host and creator of the wonderful, very wonderful Cult Vault podcast. Welcome, Casey. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, Sean. Hi, Jules. Thank you so much for the invitation.
We worked our way through scheduling troubles and we managed to make it happen.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about this, for sure. This is going to be great.
So I'm going to pull a card out of your own deck, Casey, and I'm going to start off the show and by asking you if you could tell something about yourself to us.
Well, I am a full-time podcaster. It's my full-time job. I am a mother to two beautiful children. They are 2 and 3, and they are just magnificent best friends, and they keep me on my toes. I am Ciaran Warner, the investigative journalist, once told me that he's like a poor man's version of a cult expert, and I feel like I identify with that. And come September, I will be enrolling onto the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University to become an accredited cult expert.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So not quite of a poor version then.
The proper version.
Yeah, the proper version.
Hopefully at some point. I don't know if there has to be a doctorate involved for that, but we'll see.
Something that I noticed about your show, and I had been listening to it for a while before reaching out to you, but that the format has really changed since the earliest episodes, and I totally get how that goes. You know, everybody finds their feet in doing one thing or versus another, but you really started off as like a much more of a presentation type of show where you were researching topics and then presenting them, and like in a show format. And I just wondered how that transformation happened. Was it something that you intended to change, or did it come out just sort of on its own?
It's an interesting question, and it's probably one that I get asked the most often before interviews when I say to people,
all right.
"Do you have any questions for me?" And they say, "Yeah, how did you get into this?" And so I say this, which is almost scripted at this point. I started the podcast during lockdown. Our firstborn was 4 months old, and I was binge watching box sets on TV and thought to myself that I wanted to come out the other end of lockdown with something more than just an understanding of all the characters in the hit TV show Lost. So I started thinking about different things I could do. I tried baking, which didn't work very well, knitting, which I couldn't stick with, video editing, which I did enjoy, but the final product was so time consuming that I couldn't stick to that either. So I thought about doing a podcast, and I found a bunch of old notes that I had on unsolved mysteries that I just find absolutely fascinating. And my friend phoned me and said that she'd just finished reading Beyond Belief by Jenna Miscavige Hill, David Miscavige's niece, the current leader of Scientology. And she said it was fascinating. And there was so much more involved with the subject of cults than she first realized. So she was like, do a podcast on cults. And I said, well, that could be interesting. I don't know too much about the subject. I know a bit from things I've seen and shows I've watched. So I'll try that. And the original format was a deep dive researched approach where I put together a timeline of events on infamous groups, starting with the likes of Jonestown, and just telling the story from information that I could find online. And that went really well. And I was enjoying that. Despite a few issues with, Audacity stops recording halfway through, or programs crash and you lose your work, and all the teething issues that you get when you decide to start a podcast.
We know those very well.
It's like heartbreaking, but I feel like if you can push through those first few issues, you can create some really wonderful stuff. And I was getting good feedback, and people were listening to my show outside of my family and friends, which, is the first big deal. And then I got contacted by an author named Helen Zuman, who had written a memoir called Mating in Captivity about her time on Zendik Farm. And I had never heard of Zendik before. And I had no idea that intentional communities could present in the way that Zendik Farm did. And I read Helen's memoir and I was just blown away by the parallels between infamous cults that people like myself that typically don't know too much about the subject have heard about, and also these obscure groups that exist all around the world in these communities that people aren't even aware of. All the group of people that don't really socialize with anyone that live on the farm property up the road from us. So I asked Helen if she would be willing to sit down and interview with me, and she said yes. And I'd never interviewed anyone in that capacity before, and my back was dripping with sweat. And I think I spoke to Helen for about 5 hours because I really wanted to dissect her book with her. And she sat down with me for just so long. And the episode was so well received that I began receiving emails from people around the world asking to share their stories, and that was it. The trajectory of the show completely changed, and now we are 255 episodes or so in, and I would say that 90% of those are interview based episodes.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That is very impressive. That's a lot of episodes.
It's a lot. There's a lot of these stories, unfortunately. It seems like just a never ending contact from individuals that want to share their story, which is amazing that people are taking their voices and having ownership over their stories in such a way. But of course, ideally, I'd love to run out of content one day.
Yeah.
Well, that would be fantastic. I feel the same way. I wish there was nothing for us to talk about because we tend to talk about mostly terrible things. Yeah. And in fact, that's become our new tagline is a podcast about terrible ideas. And it really seems to be the thing that ties everything together.
Yeah.
But what you mentioned about these really small groups that just live on the farm up the road, is that the same thing as what's sometimes called like a family cult?
I would say sometimes I think that's the case. It depends on the dynamic of the group and the setup of the group. A family cult, I would say, is typically made up of a household of people where there are parents or parental figures and children that are being subjected to a particular set of tactics or manipulations that take away their independence, their critical thinking, and result in some type of indoctrination where a belief system is placed onto vulnerable individuals in a home. Doesn't have to be children, it can be other adults. We see in domestic abuse situations the intimate partnerships can be considered one-on-one cults or family cults if there's a number of people being subjected to that type of treatment in an insular environment in a home.
Mm-hmm. So it's a really small scale, but of the same mechanisms that we see in high control groups and typically cults, but probably other things too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of these groups will tend to have more identifiable financial coercion and sexual coercion because the groups are smaller. The patterns of behavior, the controlling behavior is slightly easier to identify than with a large group setting where individuals are being financially coerced into giving 10-20% of their earnings to tithing, for example, where it's under the guise of religious practices. That is easier to explain to individuals in a way that doesn't feel coercive than it would be for somebody to take another person's bank cards or checkbooks, access their finances, keep receipts for everything, control what's ordered and bought inside the home, control what's eaten inside the home, ration food as a means of maintaining control over finances. I feel like in those types of environments, you might be able to really look at those situations and identify some of the controlling behaviors a bit easier than you would if there is a lot of other influence and rhetoric that's being used to justify other controlling behaviors that are taking place. But of course, it's not always the case that you would be able to look, and usually, typically, most individuals that aren't aware of this type of work would look at a family and say, wow, that looks like a cult to me. A family cult is a thing that is now becoming more widely recognized within the cult awareness spectrum, which is great, of course.
We did an episode about Nazi homeschoolers, where it was this family that they were it wasn't rhetorically saying that they were Nazis in the way that word is thrown around.
They weren't getting called Nazis. They were referring to themselves as such.
Yeah, and they would homeschool their children, but control what their kids could see. There's absolutely no TV. It was the kind of information that was able to come in was so limited and on lockdown. Even their interactions with the outside world, they taught the children, hey, nobody's going to understand it, so you need to keep quiet to preserve the family and to preserve our integrity and everything like that. There's a lot of parallels there, but it's not a religion that they were doing. So we think of cults typically as a religion, but this one was some of the same mechanisms.
I think that's the difficult thing with a lot of cult media that exists in the world. It comes into the subject through a number of very limited avenues, although that is changing. And typically we see more cult media that is centered around religious groups. A lot of them exist, so it makes sense that that's the case. A lot of them are made up of large numbers of people. So again, that's another reason why we have a lot of people speaking out about their experiences. But homeschooling in itself, that can be an extremely coercive and controlling environment for vulnerable individuals with the information control that you've just spoken about. Bringing in extremist and radicalized beliefs on side of that, it works in tandem with that insular environment, with that information control, with that indoctrination of a child from a very young age who has no idea of what else exists outside of that environment. And what those two things in tandem do, the belief system and the enclosed environment, is it stops an individual from being able to access anything else. Because if you are restricted in making outside connections, where do you go if you decide that you do want to leave? It's a system that where all of the nefarious tactics complement one another to really psychologically and physically imprison an individual into that environment. So
yeah,
Nazi homeschooling is it sounds like, yeah, extremely culty to me.
and even we talked with Steph Halmhofer about Atlantis and Brother 12. She brought up a idea called persecuted knowledge, where that seems to be a reinforcing mechanism that we see, where you have this fringe belief, or it doesn't even have to be a fringe belief necessarily, but the idea is that you have access to this special belief and everybody else just doesn't get it. So the more that people say that belief is lopsided, it doesn't have evidence, it doesn't have credibility, the more persecuted you feel, the more justified you feel in your beliefs. Do you see some of these things, patterns like this in some of the cults that you've explored?
Yeah, consistently. That is one of the big us versus them methods that is used, whether it's from the pulpit or whether it's from a school study session, or whether it's in a knitting club up the road.
Yeah.
These us versus them mentalities, which are used to divide individuals inside the group from people outside of the group, will use things like not being understood, or being the chosen ones, and being holier than thou. And it creates this environment then that when something like social services come somewhere to check up on the children because there's been complaints, or there is an idea that some children might be being abused in some way in one of these environments, as soon as social services leave, that is the persecution. This is everything we told you would happen, and now it's happening. People don't understand our beliefs. They're trying to split us up. Awful things will happen to you if you get taken by social services. You'll be abused, you'll be murdered, you'll be sold, you'll be forced to sell drugs on the street. When ironically, often the things that vulnerable individuals are told will happen to them if they are taken by social services or by agencies that are trying to help people out of abusive environments, those things are happening to people inside the environments. But of course, they are being told that it's for the greater good, or it's God's will, or your role in this group is to, sleep with whoever the leader tells you to sleep with, or whichever controlling aspects are used within the particular group.
Well, that's something that we really encountered when we were learning about the Duggar family from the show 19 and Counting, which started off at 17 and Counting, and with the Advanced Training Institute, ATI. And it was the same sort of situation with the resistance to ever contacting any kind of outside authority, and then this sort of preloading this mistrust of governmental institutions in general. That they're, like you said, like all these terrible things are going to happen if you ever talk to any of these people. So, and very similarly to the preparation that we saw in the Nazi homeschooling family, the preparation for that was done to the children, just in case they ever did encounter people, to like, this is they're
Yes.
already prepped in advance about how to respond to questions from a
Yeah.
social worker or a concerned teacher if they are actually in a public school, or just some other adult at a playground or something. And
Yeah.
so they're very well prepared to either keep their mouths shut or to answer in very specific ways to preserve the secrecy inside the group.
Yeah, yeah. I remember specifically an interview I did with a survivor of the Children of God who talked about being coached into exactly what to say if social services picked up on the sexual abuse, the prolific sexual abuse of children that was taking place in the various communes around the UK and the world regarding the Children of God. And the deceivers yet true Bible verse was used to justify why you can't lie to us about anything, and you have to tell us everything, and you have to write notes that we can read and keep journals that we can read, and have public shaming ceremonies and gatherings where we expect you to lay out all the sinful thoughts you've had, or all the extra rations of food that you've eaten. Yet if somebody from the outside comes to you, you must lie to them to protect us and to allow us to continue our mission for God. And so deceive is yet true is a Bible verse that's been twisted and manipulated, as all of the Bible verses have been, to further the agenda of the respective group. And what you said there about the Duggar family, specifically the Advanced Training Institute, with the teachings around misogyny, is another thing that is happening in at the same time as the threats of things happening. So women are being subjugated horrifically within these environments and are being told, if you leave, you will be subjugated in these other environments whilst it's happening to them in real time. So it's a really difficult thing. And it's like Jan Jelalich says, if there's a tapestry, everything weaves together to work. But if you can pull one thing and the whole tapestry comes apart, you are able to start recognizing all the different small, nuanced controlling mechanisms that are used to create that self-sealing system that is almost impossible at times to break free from.
With the cults, one thing that I really wanted to ask you, the word cult, this is going to sound pedantic for a second to get into the nitty gritty of semantics, but it is really fascinating to me where not that long ago, anthropologists and archaeologists perhaps and other people in similar fields would use the term cult simply to describe the rituals behind a group. And over probably, I think, during the 20th century, that term started to pick up a new connotation in popular culture and popular usage. I mean, it's still used in academic fields in that original sense. But one of the things I wanted to ask is, what do you think of your usage of the word cult? What does that mean when you're using it, and have you reflected on its meaning? Are there other words or other ways to think about cults other than how we've kind of come to this term in popular usage?
That's a really tough question, isn't it? I'm sure that the two of you have had this conversation and think about this in your own time as well. Absolutely, the term cult is still used to talk about ancient Egyptian groups that existed where people would be given to the sun god Ra. Lives would be, given in ritualistic sacrifices. People, anthropologists and archaeologists, they discover burial sites, mass burial sites today, even all of the time, where these sacrifices have taken place, and those rituals are considered part of cultic groups that were around during that time. And as you mentioned, over the years, the term changed to, in most dictionary definitions, to identify any type of religious group that is not traditional Christianity. So Christian Science or Jehovah's Witnesses would be considered cults by some mainstream scholars, by some dictionaries that still use that definition. And significantly after the events of Jonestown, the word really started to be used in a new context. There are some groups that you can look into, or that listeners can look into, of the early 1900s. Mayotus Blackburn was the leader of a group. I can't even. I mean, it was called the Blackburn Cult, but the official name was something like the Royal Arms of the Great 11. And in newspapers in the early 1900s,
there was so much swag in the late 1800s and early 1900s when it came to the naming conventions for these groups.
I mean, masters of wisdom.
Oh my gosh, they were just there was no sense of humility whatsoever.
Interestingly, Mayotus Blackburn took a lot of her teachings from Mary Baker Eddy.
Oh, of course.
Mary Baker Eddy.
Baker Eddy, yeah.
Mayotus Blackburn took a lot of influences from Mary Baker Eddy and actually wanted to join forces with her at one point. And Christian Science had taken on this whole life form of its own. So Mary Baker Eddy was kind of like, no, I'm not interested in that, but thanks for the offer.
I've got my own scheme running over here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Which unfortunately is still in existence today. But the Divine Order of the Royal Arms of the Great 11 was a 1920s group where newspaper clippings say this woman was running a cult. So you do see it in the early 1900s being used in that sense, because it wasn't all religious. There was a lot of New Age influences, as we recognize from the work of Aleister Crowley taking place at that time as well. A lot of esoteric movements were picking up at that time. And today, after Jonestown, it's much more of a pejorative term that is used to explain various different groups: one-on-one cults, family cults, political cults, therapy cults, online cults. And it is difficult to not look at everything and say, oh, that looks like a cult, but also to recognize that the term itself is evolving as the world is evolving, because technology plays a huge part in how people now access extremist groups or get funneled into different types of online radicalization. So I don't know how I understand the word still. I often think to myself, is this a cult? And then I think about how difficult is it to leave. If you're in a group,
Yeah.
if you were to walk away, what would be the consequences? Would you lose your eternal soul? Would you lose all of your family, friends, connection, social groups, community, job? If it's like a sect of Mormonism, typically those groups are so large and there are so many generations that all of the businesses, you need a roofer, you get a Mormon roofer. If you need your car fixed, you take it to a Mormon mechanic. So in those situations, if you leave a group like that, you also have no more work coming in for your job or your trade. So if you can't walk away and be unscathed in some way that truly damages yourself, your identity, your well-being, then I start to question, are there other things involved in that group that you could look at an expert's framework and it fits into what would be described as a cult? How I use the term is not very often on the podcast itself because of legal reasons.
Sure, you have a whole
Interesting.
set of different
I
considerations in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we I use the group I use the term group, movement, congregation, religion, home, family, but everybody that comes on the show decides whether or not they want to use that term, and that is down to their personal and independent decision making. And if an individual identifies with that term, then I think that that's more power to them after the experiences they've had respectively.
Yeah, I
That is
totally
really
agree
interesting.
about treating it as a one-off basis rather than a mass label, and that's really been where our resistance has been in just sort of haphazardly applying that to different groups. Using that particular label, and it also has it has another, there's another feature when you can just so easily name something that it's very easy to just disregard it at that point. Oh, that's another cult.
Yes.
You might as well just say like that's a group of wackos or something like that. And then even if their
All of the
behavior there
processing
might
stops.
all exactly. I mean, even if their general body of actions would justify calling them crazy, you don't think about it anymore. It's there's no further interest in understanding what's going on with this group or trying to reveal the dynamics that operate at the group level, and let alone the sometimes incredibly torturous experiences that happen at the individual level. And none of that, it's so easy to disregard. It becomes just a
Yeah.
headline
And
rather than a full exploration of the
yeah,
of the group and everything involved around it.
I had a patron message me that exact thing. She said to me, if we call everything a cult, then it really diminishes the stories that people come forward with
Hmm.
when they use that word themselves. So it's difficult when you begin your journey of education into this subject, as I'm sure you've both started to recognize. It's difficult not to see the cultic elements of a lot of things in typical society that people would never even begin to think are cult like. But also, it's important to have that awareness that if we do overuse that word, it will lose its significance, as you've said, Jules. It's like it's almost like thought terminating cliches that are used in
Absolutely.
cults themselves.
Exactly. It is a very similar
Yeah.
process. It is a thought terminating cliche. That's I think the one group that where we really had an issue with that, Jules, was when we were talking about the Raelians.
Yeah.
When talking about them, it's like there isn't this large collection of horror stories from individual members. There's definitely an exploitative component to it. There's definitely, a series of thought terminating cliches involved in it. There's a lot of control that's being applied to members from the top. And there's definitely a punishment for not following the rules that can be levied against people. But at the same time, especially when you look at it in this broader sort of neighborhood of other groups that are operating in with these dynamics, it seems to come up as much less of it with many fewer infringements on people than many of these other groups do, for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it was pretty. I mean, I would almost describe it as pretty tame compared to a lot of the other stuff that we consider.
As bizarre as their collection of beliefs are, they don't tend to result in the same sort of terrible histories that you find with other groups.
I think that's the difficult line. What you described there, Sean, with the list of restrictions and requirements, I would absolutely class that as cult-like. Mm-hmm. And it's part of my education coming to realize that even though groups don't always have a catastrophe or some hideous event that takes place, like the Branch Davidians with Mount Carmel, for example, if the 51-day standoff never took place with the Branch Davidians, people might have not realized who lived there and what was happening, but it was still a cult.
It was still a cult.
It was still, there was still things happening inside that compound that we just might never have heard about. The 51-day standoff that took place allowed the world to come to recognize what was taking place inside that building. But again, if a group is getting together for a book club, and the leader of the book club says that people need to pay an upfront subscription, and the leader of the book club is collecting personal information on somebody and divulging it in a public setting, those are cult-like elements. But does that make the book club a cult? That's where it's really
Goodreads
difficult.
Is a cult. I get it.
Goodreads.
Well, I think Amanda Montell's podcast, A Little Bit Culty, she that's the type of episode that Amanda might put out, is like the cult of Goodreads. Although she's an author, so maybe not.
She still wants those ratings, but that just shows the reach and the influence of Goodreads, which is Amazon anyway.
It's a really tough area and ground to cover in terms of how you use that term. But I think what has happened with the portrayal in media is that there does have to be some type of catastrophic event or a mass suicide or murder that creates this idea that that's what then allows it to be labeled a cult in the media. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that. So it is tough. It's a difficult one. Yeah. But the Raelian, that sounds culty to me.
It definitely did to us as well. Yeah. But the multi-level marketing schemes all seem cultish to me too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Even though there's typically there's exceptions, but there's typically no religious component to them. I mean, you do get a religious component with some of the old ones, especially like Amway or something. But the younger ones, it might just be a financial objective, and everybody's bound together with this same sort of secularized prosperity gospel sort of type of mentality. But you still have this prevailing structure that binds everybody together, and again, there's a lot of punitive aspects to not following the rules, which mainly involve just getting ostracized. But when this is your group and you value your membership, getting ostracized has value.
And you could even have
Absolutely.
some, like you talked about, one that was really fascinating to me was the troubled teen industry.
Oh
You were
yes.
talking
Oh my
to
God. Yeah.
Meg Applegate, and there's not necessarily a religious component, but what's striking to me about that is in a lot of cases you have the cult where they're trying to be isolated and insular from mainstream society, but with the troubled teen industry, it's almost like a reverse card in Uno, where you're not fitting in with mainstream society, and so the mainstream solution, the I don't know, orthodox or institutional solution is to send you to one of these places that are basically cult like. They're using the same high control mechanisms, and absolutely horrendous and not really based on science, anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. The troubled teen industry, not only is the blueprint model based on a 1970s cult that did exist, which would be
I was gonna
Synanon,
say, yeah,
it
Synanon.
is it is very cult-like in the way that individuals' leisure time and relationships are restricted, people's clothing and dieting is restricted, movements are monitored, stalls on the toilet doors are taken off. Staff will perform cavity searches and strip searches on children and young adults. Every element of an individual's existence in those in those troubled teen industry facilities, wilderness camps, or therapeutic boarding schools is monitored down to when they go to the toilet. And that in itself is the most cult-like existence a person can experience. And of course, Jules, you mentioned that there isn't always a religious aspect, but there are religious-based troubled teen schools that do exist.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Meg Applegate, probably one of the best people to talk to about this industry itself, in terms of Meg's personal experiences and her advocacy and education that she brings to the world. So what an amazing guest to have had on your show.
Yeah, yeah, that was a really fascinating one. You know, speaking of things that are not backed by evidence or a coherent model of reality, um, something that I found a lot in looking at some of the groups like these is that belief is accepted to be able to just trump expertise. That you can say, well, I believe it, and I think pluralism and embracing diversity gets conflated very often in our culture, in the Western world, where we value some of these, like in the UK or in the United States, we value some of these ideas of, you can practice whatever you want and you can believe whatever you want. That saying that you believe something has some kind of inherent value to it,
Yeah.
and then you can just use that to dismiss knowledge that is accumulated, from experts and people who actually know how this works because they spend their whole lives studying it. Do you find some of these? What kind of things like this do you find in studying these groups?
I think this manifests in many different ways across various different groups. You might see the Jehovah's Witnesses talk about not going to law enforcement with reports of abuse because their model of judicial continuance is best done by them who have the word of Jehovah than it is by law enforcement and the legal system that the rest of the world abides by. So this is one example that you see of groups saying we know better. There are things like the Lemurian Mystery School with Liana Shanti, an online figure at the moment with a very prolific following, who says we should cleanse and we should use coffee enemas, and we should listen to my tracks on repeat. And if we do these things, we can overcome ailments. And if we speak to each other in certain ways, we can identify childhood abuse and overcome it by accessing my courses on recovering from certain things.
That
Most
sounds
of
kind of like
which
Kellogg. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I imagine most of the time professionals would look at those documents and say, this is absolutely not what we should be doing. If an individual has an eating disorder, or if an individual has psychological or mental health issues that need to be addressed by a professional, I don't think the approaches that are being used in certain online circles would be beneficial to the individuals that are accessing them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It seems like alienation is such a huge component to both keeping people in these and even attracting outside members to groups like these, where you're looking for some kind of a sense of belonging. I mean, we see it with Reddit and 4chan and 8kun and places like this, where it attracts all sorts of people who are, I mean, I'm thinking of like incel culture, if you will, even just attracting these people who are feeling alienated, and all of a sudden they've got 10 other people that they're talking to that surprisingly feel the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh, there was that enormous kerfuffle that occurred among the incel community a few months ago because one of the most prolific members of the community revealed that he had sex, and immediately he was attacked by everybody because he abandoned them.
Yeah, I think that's the difficulties with understanding online spaces and how individuals can become radicalized in certain ways or enter um, somewhat dangerous or unconventional spaces. Because if you have some kind of interest, or if you have questions to some strange subject, or if you have maybe like a really unheard of kink of some type, there is a space that exists now for you to find the answers or the community that will allow you to feel accepted, as you've said, Jules. And then with the community stuff that you mentioned, Sean, if you finally found a place where you could speak openly, or where people could give you the answers to all of these questions you've had, if something small happens that you don't necessarily agree with, can you forego really thinking about that and wondering how it really sits with you? Or do you walk away from that community? And once that line is crossed, there is often a continuance of things that happen, and bigger things that happen, and bigger things that happen. And not always the line is crossed. Sometimes individuals aren't given access to information that they would need to make a critical decision, by design a lot of the time, with groups like Shinchunji that are very kind of cloak and dagger about their recruitment tactics. But what we see with a lot of online spaces are things like Pizzagate, where you go from talking about something to somebody actually going to a restaurant to look for kids in a basement where there is no basement in that restaurant. And so sometimes you see this turn into offline harm, which is what a lot of the worries are in the cult awareness space at the moment. And interestingly, Sean, you mentioned John Atack earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to be meeting with him in a couple of weeks to do another recording for his YouTube channel, where we are going to be specifically focusing on the difficulties of online spaces and things like the Jordan Peterson effect. And I know that you've done an episode on
quite a few.
Where Are the Real Men? And I saw that title of that episode and I was like, oh no, I can't, I don't know if I can speak to Jules and Sean if that. And then I realized that it was, not actually how you thought about the subject.
So my sort of tongue-in-cheek episode titling has come to has bit us a couple of times. We've managed to receive some following and some attention from people who think that we're actually encouraging these topics or
Yeah.
we're in favor of them, and then getting
A surprising
incredibly
number of crypto
disappointed.
bros.
Getting incredibly disappointed and vocal sometimes with us in direct messages about how sad they are that we've let down this cause.
Yeah, I think you always want to be careful and do due diligence on individuals that you speak with and share your stories with. If I was to go on to a podcast and find out that the individuals I was speaking with were anti-LGBT, for example, that's
Mm-hmm.
not a podcast that I want to be associated with in any way.
Yeah.
Because it's completely in conflict with my own ideals and beliefs and the mission statement that I have for my podcast. So I saw the title of that episode and I was like, and then I listened to the episode and realized that it was kind of clickbaity. So kudos for that.
Oh, I don't know what's worse, is that we're actually like Josh Hawley followers, or we're just clickbaiting.
Yeah, interestingly though, about 4 years ago, my partner would drive to work when he had a longer commute, and he would listen to Jordan Peterson. And he would come home and he would say, I've been listening to this person. He's a really interesting speaker. He has some really interesting things to say that I agree with. But occasionally he says things that I don't agree with, and it feels very culty. And I was like, oh, okay. And he was like, I think that Jordan Peterson has the potential to be a cult leader. And he was like, let me tell you his story. And then let me show you some clips. And now, of course, we're in full blown kind of post potentially mental health issues, Jordan Peterson, where the individuals like my partner who can kind of latch onto a few of the ideals about, the man's role in the house, not in a misogynistic way, but in a taking responsibility for yourself kind of way. Like, you are in this family, you have a role in this family. It's not necessarily to overrule the family, but it is to play an active part. I think all of us can agree that idealistically that sounds okay. But it's kind of like when you read the core like tenets of Dianetics, and you're like, oh, on a basic life principle, that doesn't sound too bad. But then the more you get into it, and the more twisted and skewed and coercive it gets, the more the sunk cost fallacy plays in, and the more people are like, well, I've been a follower of Jordan Peterson for 2 or 3 years now, so even though we're talking about horrific stuff to do with Elliot Page, I'm still going to agree with everything that Jordan Peterson says because I've been doing it for 3 or 4 years. So the Jordan Peterson effect is something that I'll be talking about with John in a couple of weeks, but an interesting crossover between the work that you've been doing on your show.
Yeah, that is fascinating stuff, because I first encountered Peterson quite a few years ago when he was I don't know, he was not very widely known at the time, and he was fresh out of the encounter he had with his students at the university, and I think he was in
Toronto,
Ontario,
I think, right?
at the time. Okay, in Toronto,
I
and
think I don't know for sure, but I think it was Toronto.
And it was all of this sort of, this backlash of support, basically, sort of the tide rolling back out, and realizing, that he had all of these people that were interested in also having a predisposed bias toward, the students of a university age who were interested in having a different type of structure to their education. And then there he was, he found himself, like boosted up by Joe Rogan, and with his own with his own growing platform. And fast forward a few years, and we see him partnered up on the Daily Wire, and it's been quite a road for this guy. Of course, with the side trail that led through being a guest of Viktor Orban's in Hungary, and going through benzo withdrawals, and then the carnivore diet, and now he has his daughter Michaela as this sort of health and wellness influencer, and oh boy,
and that's a whole other industry
with the religious twist on top of it as well, because I've heard from people that have watched the big arena talks that Peterson does occasionally will proselytize basically about how people need to come to Jesus and be born again. So you have all of these talks about, and now we have the horrific, really anti-trans commentary, just the disgusting rhetoric that makes my skin crawl, quite honestly, right through to, and so to get over this, we need to believe in the Lord and Savior. And it's just weird because there's a lot of things that are coming together, and it feels like the overall mission is to generate Christians in Jordan Peterson's idea of
in
perfect
his
Christians.
image,
I mean,
like somebody who has almost no familiarity with either the history of Christianity or their texts, but yet at the same time he's approaching it as if there isn't all of this thousands of years of already filled in stories. He's approaching it as if he just has this idea of Jesus and he's going to reinvent it now.
Yeah.
But it's really just a Sunday school understanding.
Exactly. Yeah. That's actually not that dissimilar from the way a lot of cult leaders operate, is that they reinvent it, they reinterpret things, and based on their own particular picadillos. And that's really what Peterson has done.
And it started really just getting some book sales with only tossing out a few handfuls of horrendous things that he's saying here and there, to today being totally unhinged and mask off about the whole thing. But it is that mechanism, or that process of doing the bait and switch. First, we start with make your bed, and then we move on to genocide. Like it.
Yeah, but it's a very slow process, like with Dianetics, and like with the Church of Scientology. And again, it's like, if I pepper in a few problematic comments, how much of it is going to be accepted in the broader sense of my teachings and my proselytizing? Because if I can get away with a few of these comments thrown in, eventually I can build on that until we get to where we are today, and a mass following of individuals who identify with people like Andrew Tate, and just all the things that are wrong in the world, in my opinion.
I think we've done 2 episodes on Tate.
As a woman.
Yeah, we've actually talked about Andrew Tate twice on our show. Once just in general terms, and then after he got arrested. The Dianetics thing, that was I think probably one of the more subversive actions of any religious group or cult, or whatever particular terminology we'd like to use as a label, that I can think of, and at least in modern times, mainly in terms of how effective it was. I think I remember those commercials when I was a kid advertising that book.
Wow.
And there'd be this volcano erupting in the background, which I now know was, which was where all the Thetans are. And, but it's this animation of this volcano erupting, beautiful, like very, like Hollywood cinematics, and like end to end, the entire commercial. I mean, it basically plays like a, what's his name? The Roland Emmerich, the director who makes all the disaster films like 2012 and stuff like that. And then this booming voice and talking about all the in very general terms, problems that people face and the things that are hard to understand about life. And then it just flashes the book up there, this sort of airport paperback book on screen.
Yeah.
And then I remember seeing it at the grocery store. I remember seeing it places there. I remember thinking like, oh, that's the book with the commercial. And,
Yeah,
and
that's how it works.
I was, I don't know, maybe 10 years old at the time. And and I just can't imagine how many people that particular tactic worked on.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, Sean, because going back to John Atack and the book that you've just ordered, Opening Our Minds, which is an amazing read, there's a section in the book about advertising and how advertising, where it came from, how it's changed over the years, and how it influences us today in terms of devices listening to us, personalized ads, which is something that is very kind of new in the last 5 to 10 years. And the idea that all of us are being influenced in some way continuously by what we digest, what we see, what we walk past, what we speak about with people in an everyday conversation, whether we realize it or not, which is kind of an existential, scary thing to consider. How do I not be influenced? The answer is you always will be in one way or another. I think I'm having to kind of come to terms with that. But Dianetics, again, not the first, not Scientology, not the first company, business, religion, cult to use this tactic, but it's being used now by so many. Just to go back to Liana Shanti, will have things on the website that says, are you struggling with and this is not exact, but examples that you can find on websites like this. Are you struggling with anxiety, depression, weight loss, can't find a job, making connections with people, getting a promotion at work, and basically there's a whole list of things that all of us would look at and say, yes, I would like help with one of those things, or it would be nice to have information on how to tackle one of those things. And it's the hook. It's one of the things that gets you in. And what is really tough about breaking free of that is things like star signs. You go to the part in a magazine or a newspaper and you're like, wow, that sounds exactly like what I'm going through in my life right now, like, by design. Like, and then you get all the way back through to New Age. Yeah, exactly. Then you get back through to New Age spirituality and all of the difficult things that come with that part of the world.
When fortune cookies were good and they would say things like, you're going to meet someone new and interesting in the near future. Oh, I did meet somebody new and interesting. Exactly. It worked.
Yeah. I'm going back to that restaurant because they just know.
They have the best fortune cookies.
Now it's generic life advice. I want a prediction.
And those questions you mentioned about, do you have anxiety? You're having trouble in your relationship or something like that? They all boil down to just asking, who among you readers of this post are actually humans? Because this is something that is shared by and has been shared by all humans since humans existed. For the past 300,000 years, we have experienced these exact problems. We've had trouble in relationships. We've been worried about something. We've had problems. There's always, I mean, as soon as you can imagine what the future might be like, or compare your situation to somebody else's, you realize that there's something that's not the same. I want something that this other person has, or I used to have something I no longer have. And then this creates all of our issues. And if you get somebody who talks about that, then somebody who says, I can solve this.
Charismatically as well, in a way that makes you think like that there's no way they couldn't do those things. It groups are very good at, especially new age groups and online communities are very good at asking those questions, Sean, and identifying those vulnerabilities in people, but also, as I like to say, throwing so much shit at the wall to see what sticks, in terms of we have some teachings about Christ, but we also have some teachings about star signs, and we also like to go for walks in the wilderness and experience equine therapy with horses. And it's just kind of like, and these websites are colorful and wild, and there's so much stuff happening, and all of us could go onto one of these wild websites and be like, wow, this really speaks to me. Because everybody is just seeing what they can throw and that will stick. And it's quite scary.
It's really a carnival with something new behind every door, whichever door you pick.
Exactly that.
And there really is something that has the potential to resonate with just about everyone. If you've ever read or been inspired by some quote that was attributed to the Buddha, we have something from the Buddha here. Or if you've ever read any Chinese philosophy, we have some Lao Tzu over here, some quote from something he wrote. And if you ever thought about one of the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus, we have a little bit of that too. and they
Exactly.
just keep they have this sort of this supremely syncretic idea that we're going to gather all of these threads together,
Yeah.
and
Oh my
there'll be
goodness.
something in here for everybody. And
Yeah, you're so right, Sean. That's it. You two have been doing a lot of work and have a very good understanding of this subject, it seems. We are all poor man's versions of cult experts.
we are,
Yes,
yes,
my
we
brain has
absolutely are.
melted long ago from listening to these people and reading
Yeah.
them.
And I think that's where it, the one of the things I think one of the and the I guess this is going to inadvertently segue into me toward a question that I wanted to ask you, but the one of the things that seems to be at play here is like regarding adults, who are encountering this messaging. This doesn't apply to children who are raised in environments, but when adults encounter these messaging, I think that one thing that seems to be a commonality is that while I still think it's true that everybody experiences these anxieties and worries and these particular problems that are supposedly going to be solved with, listening to the tapes or moving to a compound or something like that, that the people who seem to really be a good fit for these groups or the intended recipients for the messages are people who think that other people don't share these problems. That I tend to have, I'm in a worse situation, or I'm somehow singular in the issues that I have, and that other people don't encounter these same things, and so they somehow have concluded that they're not as good, or they need something extra, or they want something that's going to find something that's going to make them feel as good as they think other people feel. And
Right.
I was wondering, that like in all the people you've spoken with and the material you've come across, whether it's going to be ex-members or people who are themselves maybe a richer version of a cult expert than we are, then have you come across any common themes when it comes to like how adults encounter these groups or how adults become attracted to
Yeah,
them?
absolutely. I think that one of the first things to consider with this particular subject is social conditioning on how people don't talk about their true thoughts and feelings, and how a lot of individuals are taught not to, well, not apart from narcissists, and this is how narcissists are able to prey on people. Don't express yourself, don't talk about your feelings. Everybody, someone somewhere has it worse than you do. I think there's a lot of not just thought terminating cliches, not just a lot of apathy in society, but a lot of social conditioning that comes with not expressing yourself, and then feeling like nobody wants to hear you won't be heard, even if you do decide to take those brave steps in opening up to people about struggles that you have and issues that you're facing, and what comes at a time of vulnerability and typically transition is that a big target is placed on your back. Narcissists and perpetrators and cult recruiters and abusers will notice those vulnerabilities in you and prey on them at your most vulnerable. If you are a person that is empathetic, if you are a person that is helpful, who wants to make a positive change in the world, who is somebody that wants to please people and help people, if you are somebody that is intelligent, these are all things that are preyed on by individuals that are trying to abuse others, much to the surprise of the general public, who think that individuals that join cults must not have any type of intelligence or critical thinking. It's quite the opposite. Misconceptions around that, as you've probably come across, are really difficult to change, but that is a necessary change to happen for people to protect themselves and arm themselves against these groups. If a person tells me that they could never be pulled into a coercive group, I believe that person is probably more likely to be pulled into a coercive group, because all of us are susceptible to these tactics. It's human nature to be in a communal environment, and that in its inherency makes us all vulnerable. But the difficult thing about a transitional period, like losing a loved one or a divorce, or your child leaves for university, or you leave for university, if you are in a situation that is unfamiliar, that leaves you vulnerable, that places you in a position where you might be a bit lost, where your critical thinking might not be working as highly as usual. If you come across an individual at that moment, that is the most dangerous position in life, in terms of being recruited or pulled into one of these groups. And I try not to use words like joins a cult or becomes a part of a cult. It's more like
There's less volition than that.
It's not a
Yeah.
choice. You're led to believe that it's a decision that you're making, right, but it's not a decision that you're making. It's all to do with suggestion and susceptibility at times where we are vulnerable. And it's really, really hard to come from a position of not being in one of these cultic environments or experiencing a coercive relationship and understanding that. And I'm still trying to practice that every day when people who have QAnon adjacent or conspiratorial thoughts jump onto my YouTube channel to leave comments, or people in certain groups that are talked about on the Cult Vault podcast come into the comments to defend the group that they're a part of. I still have to take a step back and remember all of the things that this person has been subjected to that has led them to come to my YouTube channel to defend the abusive group that they are a part of, telling me that it's the best thing that's ever happened to them in their lives. And at one point it may have been, but it does not stay that way. It's utopian and idyllic to begin with for a reason. It never stays that way. And that's why it's a cult. People say, are there any good cults? There are no good cults, because the definition of a cult is that it's something that's not good for you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, even the good cults, whatever you would call, however you would come up with that, a list that would fall under that title, are still going to have the same level of manipulation and control, or else the group wouldn't be there. Otherwise, it's just a club that you go to sometimes. And
yep, and you can leave, and it's fine.
You can,
and then it's not a cult.
Exactly, but like that actually brings up, like some. Well,
of the, try to get out of LinkedIn. Ways. That one has got to be a cult.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine some book club that's just meets once a month, but try missing a couple of meetings and see how they react. And if it's not a cult, then everybody will be happy to see you when you return.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, and it's some of the same influences that we're seeing in advertising, like we were saying before. Side effects of using this cult may include abandoning your friends and family, moving to a compound somewhere in Montana. I mean, it's a lot of the same influences that we're subjected to from all sorts of other sources in our lives.
Yeah, I think about the bias you were talking about that people tend to have, who have sort of just maybe their only connection to the inner workings of a cult is reading a journalistic piece or something like that. And some of those can be very responsible, and many of them are not. Many of them are deliberately inflammatory, so that so that the people are going to read the articles, and you have more advertising clicks and whatever. But the people who have that level of contact and that level of experience, you have that same mentality that people have, that advertising doesn't work on me. I'm not susceptible to it. I can watch dishwasher soap commercials all day long, and it won't influence which one I buy, or for anything else. But yet they manage to have a brand new pair of basketball sneakers, and that looks that's like the thing that some star has been wearing. Or they have the new album that came out from the pop star, and then they have all these other things that tell you that they are very much part of this culture, and they are just as influenced as everybody else.
It's Roy in IT Crowd when he says, "Oh, I'm not susceptible to any of that." Anyway, new Kook, the soda.
I love that you watch the IT Crowd. That's
Oh,
so
yeah.
good. That's so good.
I think we've both seen it through a few times.
What is interesting about what you've said there, Sean, about journalistic approaches and media, is something that has been on my mind for a long while. I'm not sure if you see any of my YouTube stuff, but I did a video on I think it was a Daily Mail online article that just, oh gosh, it enraged me in some ways, because ahead of the recent Netflix documentary on the raid at Waco, a lot of people that write for certain newspapers and online magazines were given early access to this documentary to write some promotional pieces ahead of the release of the documentary. And I think it was in the Daily Mail Online, and I apologize to the Daily Mail Online if it wasn't. Oh no, it was the Daily Star. It was the Daily Star. They wrote the headline was something like husband allows cult leader to bonk his wife. New Netflix documentary coming on the Branch Davidians. So I was just like, okay, I'm just going to ignore that article for a little while. And then I watched the documentary, and it's only partway through episode 2 of 3 episodes that the documentary addresses David Koresh and who he was and where he came from, without much information, and then even less information on the environment that Koresh cultivated inside that compound. And it kind of went from David Koresh joined, he was charismatic, he became a leader, and then he started sleeping with everyone's wives. And there's a section with a man that says, and he said he wanted to sleep with my wife, so of course I let him. But there's no context in the documentary on how did we get to that. And that's what I try to do on the Cult Vault podcast, is approach the whole subject. Like, people focus on NXIVM, on the women being branded. And then I speak to Susan Dones, who was one of the original members of NXIVM, who talks about being financially coerced out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there's like the cult, and then there's the inner cult of NXIVM. Every person that was working on the inside, in the inner workings of NXIVM, was being abused and coerced in some way. And the media focuses on the stuff that is most shocking to people. But what it doesn't do a lot of the time is explain to individuals who are taking in this media or trying to learn about it, is how do we get to the point where women are being branded? How do we get to the point where husbands are giving permission, in air quotes, for their wives, or for David Koresh to sleep with their wives? And what the Daily Star does is bolster that sensationalism and stops us asking questions on how do we get there. It's more like, oh my goodness, I would never do that. Oh, I'm so shocked by this. I'll go watch the documentary so I can pass judgment. Pre-judgment being, I would never let that happen. And so it goes round and round and round in circles. What I found recently with Hulu's documentary on the Larry Ray cult, Stolen Youth, was it was so well done. It was so compassionate. It focused on the stories of the survivors. And then you have newspapers and articles, Hulu's sex cult documentary, and that dismisses every survivor's story. They were subjected to horrific treatment of every abusive nature, and all the newspapers, for the most part, are focusing on is the sex cult, which is just dismissive of people's experiences, and it really silos that group into people thinking, oh, people were chained up and used for sexual exploitation, which isn't what happened. Physically, psychologically, it was part of what happened, but it wasn't the whole thing. And what Stolen Youth does is it brings us that whole narrative. It allows us to understand the entire thing with a bird's eye view. And then newspapers take that and they just focus on one part, the sensationalized part, and it's obviously, I'm on my soapbox. It's very frustrating.
Yeah,
you're speaking to something. Oh, go ahead, Jules.
I was just going to say it becomes a caricature of reality that so distorts it that we can't understand it, especially as you mentioned earlier, how we can often dismiss people for being too stupid, or they lack critical thinking skills, and that's why they're joining these sorts of things or recruited to these things, and that completely turns them into these two-dimensional beings instead of being humans with agency of some kind that are finding themselves in these
Exactly.
situations. And
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
this totally dastardly villain twirling the mustache with the tied up woman on the railroad tracks interpretation of how these cult leaders
Yeah.
work totally makes it so that we can't ever see the kind of mechanisms that are being used on us in the daily that
Yes.
might even find
Yeah.
ourselves into these sorts of things.
Exactly that. And I do feel like it's changing for the most part. And ethical content creation is something that is becoming more of a discussion. But when you talk about things like agency and then you use the term sex, sex kind of implies consent, rape doesn't. And so if you're using the term sex cult, there's already some type of subconscious understanding that, oh, perhaps this was a consensual arrangement before it wasn't, or perhaps it was always consensual. So it's very tricky to use that type of terminology, because not only is it diminishing to the survivors, and not only is it foregoing everything else that happened in that environment, but it's also kind of misleading, because the coercive methods used before any sexual exploitation took place allows us to understand through the Stolen Youth documentary that it was never consensual.
Yeah, so much of this, the lines seem to, I mean, in groups like this, the lines between what is consent and what is not consent seem to blur, because there's the words floating around there, of agreement as part of how these rituals have to work to keep these groups
Yeah,
cohesive. But just because the words are floating around there doesn't mean that there is real consent or real agreement,
yeah,
especially when you have no real other
yeah.
choice. It's like the person reading
Exactly that.
from the hostage paper, with they and off screen the gun is being pointed at them by the hostage taker, and they're saying
That's
this is
it. That's
totally
it.
consensual. I my own free will. That's what I'm doing here into the video camera.
Yeah. Yeah. What happens to you? You say the word yes, but what happens if you say no? So can it ever be consensual in that situation? Oh, you're not going to be allowed to have food for a week if you upset the hierarchy or the leader or the system. Or you are unethical, as Nexium would say. You've been unethical, which results in alienation. So being ethical is saying yes to Keith Raniere. Is that still consent? Because I don't know that it can be. So this is again another thing that is kind of wrong with some journalistic approaches. To be fair to the author of the article, he did reach out to me on Twitter, and he did say that he realizes that the terminology in the article is wrong. He apologized for it, not publicly, but he did say that he does not have a final say on what is published and how it's published. So the problem again is at the top. I do remember speaking to John Atack once, and he said to me, if in 5 or 10 years' time you can look back on your work and be happy with what you've produced and know that you don't have any regrets and you haven't sold your values and you haven't sold your morals, you will be in a good place. I don't know that you could write for the Daily Star and say that after 5 to 10 years if you were a thoroughly decent person, that you had not sold out your values or your morals by contributing to that type of publication.
I had a very similar encounter, and we actually, I mean, you just touched on some of the early reasons why Jules and I started putting this whole project together in the first place, is that we kept coming across all of this information about QAnon that was obviously just the most superficial treatment. And there was whether it was going to be journalistic or some of the other shows that were around, that were not really making much of an obvious effort at all to address how people ended up under the influence of these ideas in the first place. And even not in a coercive scenario, because especially with QAnon, that there isn't really sort of a central hierarchy. There are some core influencers that have their own personal followings, but there isn't like, dispatches from Q as outside of those original Q drops, and there's nobody to really follow, and but yet this was attractive to people, and it drew people in. And so what I have tried to do is try to understand what must it be like in the head of somebody who is
Yeah.
attracted to this. How does that resonate with an individual? It doesn't resonate with me, but I can try to imagine, if it were to resonate, then what else do I need to be thinking about? How do I see the world? And
Yeah.
about a year maybe into doing this show, I had an interaction with a journalist who had published what I considered to be an incredibly irresponsible article. I think it was about Negative 48, actually, when they had first gathered together in Dallas waiting for JFK to return. And,
Ugh.
which is, it's, yeah. I have the same reaction. And it was just such a flippant treatment of what had, addressing all the people that had gathered there without really any consideration for those people as individuals, what their families were
Yeah.
experiencing, really anything. And
Yeah.
I was vocal about it in reply to this person's posting their own article on Twitter. It wasn't the response that you got where there was any kind of real acknowledgement. It was more like, well, sort of what do you expect kind of reaction.
Yeah.
But that's really, that's been something that I think is really lacking out there and I don't really know how to remedy it other than to just get more people talking about it along these lines and wondering,
Yeah.
like, what else is going on? How does this work? And I find that there's, that not only makes people prone to the type of thinking that, is associated with QAnon and general conspiracism, but it also makes it hard to talk to those people because it creates this reactionary environment against them, where people don't want to ask further questions. I mean, you mentioned the word agency a moment ago, and what does that really mean in a circumstance where people are being coerced and manipulated? How much agency does an
Yeah.
individual have? And I think that is really an issue because, one, I don't think very many people have considered what it means to even have agency.
Yeah.
And also, we're living in an environment where everybody is influenced all the time. And so how much agency do any of us have? And these are not questions that we tend to reflect upon at any point. And
No.
that makes it so that we're kind of in a free for all where all of this stuff can happen and many other things that we haven't even imagined yet.
And maybe Mercury is in Gatorade again.
Yeah, I imagine not just the things that have occurred and trying to figure them out, but the thing that gives me pause sometimes is, so what horrors are we going to encounter in the future? Because we haven't worked this stuff out. What else are we going to be susceptible to? What political movements or religious fascinations or whatever do we have just around the next bend, because we haven't really sorted this out in our own heads yet?
Yeah, yeah. It's a really tough one. And the negative 48 situation is I react that way because I recognize a group of people who have found a community that is led by an individual that is unfortunately either most likely not not well or is profiting off of individuals who are vulnerable. So that is what kind of makes me put my head in my hands. I think the fact that you sit down and contemplate the positions individuals are in when they find familiarity or where they find connection with the types of groups that Negative 48 leads, or the Queen of Canada, or whichever of
I
these
was going to mention
figures.
there's a parallel with Romana Didelot and Michael Prossman.
Protzman.
Yeah,
It's really tough, and I don't know how we hold journalists to any level of accountability. I don't know how we call for responsible journalism when journalists have been doing this since reporting began to exist, I imagine. And even now, if I
we like
type
to talk
in cult news on Google, I will find, the cult of the Democratic Party,
right.
the cult of the GOP,
I know.
the cult of the cult of Boris Johnson, and the cult of Nicola Sturgeon.
It's almost as bad when you
again, that word.
Yeah, it's almost as bad as when
The
you
word
search
is being
for.
used out of context,
Absolutely.
in it to further divide individuals from left and right and red and blue. It's siloing individuals because divide and conquer is the best way for people to be re-elected or elected. And journalists, it's a tactic that works, especially when some of the papers and some of the networks are in the pockets of people that want to divide and conquer. And that's a whole other conversation for like a whole other
that's
thing.
a whole other level of this.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know either, Sean, what the answer is to that. But I just hope that enough conversations take place that individuals that are identifying with certain communities and are kind of not buying into, but are finding something within certain communities and teachings, can hear the other side and still consider the other side of the argument. Oh gosh, there's just a whole thing with pro-trans and anti-trans online at the moment, and the extremism is almost the same on both sides. And people are saying, oh, no to this and yes to this, and we should dox people online, and we should show these horrific pictures, and but it's both sides of extremism using the same tactics. So I don't know that either party can be right in that sense. There has to be a way where you don't fight radicalization with radicalization, because then you become the thing that you're trying to fight, and that's how some cults are born. Some leading cult experts came from socio-political cults where they wanted to make a difference in the world, and the only way to do that was to become extremist in the groups that they existed in, before realizing that they were cult-like, and then spreading their knowledge with the world, which I am thankful for. So I really don't know. It's such an interesting but difficult subject to navigate, cults as a whole.
Yeah, and there's even the widespread media illiteracy that exists, where even the ability to discern between a good journalistic piece and something that is just absolute junk, or even yellow journalism or sensationalism is just not even in the toolkit widely for a lot of folks.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I'll see people share the Onion articles and be like, I can't believe this is happening. And I still don't know if the person is being satirical when they tweet, or if they're being serious when they share the Onion article saying that they can't believe this is happening, when obviously the Onion is a satirical paper itself. So, oh, I just don't know.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate sort of coming to the end of oneself, when it comes to considering these things, because there gets to be a point where can you go? I mean, we can know some things, like you said. I completely agree with the sentiment that there's no good outcome from fighting radicalism with radicalism. I don't, in this sense, or using the term in the sense of an entrenched ideology that I'm refusing to budge from. That there's no sense in that. I mean, there's no way to have that turn out well, because even if you get the sort of the letter of the law that you want out of it, the intent behind it is one of just controlling from the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the question of what did we compromise to get the results that we wanted, and I don't know that if we, because I am, as I would hope most people are in the world, but unfortunately don't seem to be, is pro human rights and equal rights for people that are living within the law. I don't want to say free love for all, because we saw that with the children of God, and obviously there shouldn't be intergenerational sexual arrangements, again with air quotes. It's I want to see a world where if a person wants to live away within the law as it stands now, they should be able to do that. I don't want to live in a world where we have to forego, again, our values to accomplish that. So of course, I'm pro-trans, and I worry when I see the really extremist side of pro-trans urgently, desperately trying to hold on to the rights that we've managed to gain up to this point, and saying or doing certain things to combat the anti-trans, horrible, horrific rhetoric coming from that part of the argument, and people trying to strip laws and take us back to the dark ages. I don't want to have individuals leave their values and abandon their morals in order to get what humans should have. So that's the difficult part of it. I just want to make sure that anybody listening understands that I'm not saying that we shouldn't be pro-trans, because we should be. We just have to do it the right way. We have to do it a way that is sustainable, a way that is lawful, and a way that isn't harmful to the people involved.
Quite relevant to that. I had to mute my mic for a second there because the Pride Parade is literally going by the street outside of my house right now. So I have a lot of background noise.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm in Liverpool, and they have the best celebrations here every year, and it's such a welcoming city for all marginalized community groups, and it's a wonderfully blended city, and that's why I'm still here.
You good,
Well,
Jules?
Yeah. Are you good, Casey?
I'm good, but I do have pizza here, so I am going to dash
Oh,
in,
yeah.
in, a minute. If that's okay.
Perfect.
That is perfect. Yeah.
Well,
let me go through it.
You do it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first off, I just want to thank you once again for joining us. It has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. It is. I knew it was going to be good, but it was even better than I had hoped.
It was so wonderful.
I'm so
it's been
glad.
an absolute pleasure.
Thank you both, Jules and Sean, for your time and for sitting down to talk about cults, coercive control, and to shoot the shit.
Yeah.
I appreciate you both.
Absolutely.
It was perfect. It is it's exactly like how I like conversations to go.
Absolutely.
But before we wrap up entirely, is there anything that you want to point people toward, or places that they can find where you want to be found online?
I am at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if anyone wants to reach out and have a conversation. I am at cultvaultpod on YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram, and the Cult Vault podcast is available on all podcast players, as most people's podcasts are.
Yeah, I've taken to just saying listen wherever.
Just listen.
Yeah, and you'll find it somewhere. I won't know that you listened to it, but you'll have listened to it. So it also looks like you have another live stream event coming up in July.
Do I? No more live streams.
No?
None planned right now. I did do one in July last year.
Oh, that was from last year. Okay.
So that might
That's what
be
I saw in the
if
menu.
you've visited my website, I've got the page is still up with all of the guests information from last year's 12-hour live stream. So I did one
Yeah, sorry to cause that
earlier this
panic.
month. Yeah, no, I was like, oh gosh. Yeah, not after YouTube banned me, funnily enough, for doing videos about QAnon. So don't do that, because if any cults want to take you down, they're going to use that type of content to get you banned.
Oh boy. Jules, you have anything?
No, I think that was pretty good. I gotta run outside and join this parade before it passes my house.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Take some photos and share them online.
I will.